Membership or removal, those are your options, Claudia said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the lake air. She tapped a manicured finger against the bright red notice she'd taped to my mother's door, her smile smug and cruel. Lake Path is for association members only. Last warning. Beside her, a private guard adjusted the taser, still humming from its last discharge. The acrid tang of ozone hung over the footbridge, and my mother's cane shook in her hands. Claudia's smirk deepened. You just used force on a senior standing on an easement older than your entire HOA, I said, my tone low and steady. Every camera here just became evidence, including the guards. The light on his body cam burned a steady blue, and I knew he realized what that meant. Neighbors who had frozen mid-step glanced from me to Claudia, unsure which way the wind would turn. For a moment, the balance shifted. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. My name's David Rourke, I continued, eyes fixed on the weathered boards beneath my feet. Chief of police, off-duty, recused from my own street. But I know who holds jurisdiction when private security pretends they wear a badge. Claudia's smirk faltered, just slightly, like heat bending above the water. I kept mine locked down. That footbridge wasn't just lumber. It was memory, morning fog lifting as my father taught me how to read the ripples. Evenings when he promised my mother that walking this path would keep her heart strong. He'd carved a notch in the rail for her hand, just wide enough for her thumb. Every gust through the reeds carried that promise back. And now she stood here, trembling, trying to smile through the dizziness of a taser discharge, whispering, "I'm okay," in a voice as thin as the one she used the night we buried him. The old canoe in our garage rafters creaked in my mind, sun-faded, cedar-ribbed, heavy with hours that would never return. This wasn't about fees, it was about theft of memory. I raised my phone, locked the scene with a clean sweep, spent cartridge on gravel, barbs uncollected, timestamp tied to the coordinates. A neighbor mirrored me with her own camera. Another peeled the notice off the door carefully, not smearing the ink. Small victories matter. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. Claudia tried to ride over the silence. "Policy's clear," she said, her tone brittle. "Members enjoy access. Non-compliance has consequences." She loved that word, consequences, as if it made her untouchable. I didn't rise. I let the gulls cry above us, let the guard shift nervously, let the weight of that rail groove speak. "Your policy doesn't overrule recorded access rights," I said finally. I left the words hanging, because sometimes silence is sharper than any speech. My mother's cane tapped against the boards, steady but fragile. The guard avoided my eyes, staring at his own camera like it might explode. "I'm taking her home," I said, guiding her across the boards. The guard moved aside without thinking. Each tap of her cane carried into my chest like a hammer beat. The air smelled of damp pine now, the sharp ozone fading. I breathed it in, grounding myself. Every detail, the ink bleeding on that notice, the glue loosening in the heat, burned into my mind. Evidence had a way of telling stories if you let it breathe. Neighbors leaned on their fences, pretending they were just watching the water. I spoke past Claudia, to them, to anyone who needed to hear. "Where are you watching from?" I asked, not to the HOA, but to the quiet audience of witnesses too used to folding under pressure. Their silence wasn't neutrality. It was a choice. And today I needed them with us, not behind us. I didn't waste breath telling Claudia the rest. She wouldn't have listened, but the county seal across the road caught the light like a flare. It reminded me that some lines belong to law, not to people with clipboards and power trips. She hadn't noticed that yet. She would. And when she did, she'd learn that this neighbor wasn't just another resident. I was a son, a cop, and a keeper of a promise. And promises, once broken, don't stay buried. Not here, not on this lake. I got my mother inside and settled, the cane leaning against her chair, while the tremor in her hand slowly eased. Her breathing still hitched, shallow from the jolt, but her eyes stayed sharp. "Don't let them take it, David," she whispered, her voice small but unbreakable. I promised her I wouldn't, and I meant it. That bridge, that easement, that memory, they'd tried to stamp it out in front of a whole neighborhood. That wasn't going unanswered. Back at the station, the fluorescent hum greeted me like always, steady and clinical. I wasn't in uniform tonight, but my badge still weighed heavy in my pocket. I logged into the internal complaint system, pulling recent calls connected to Lake Haven shores. The numbers didn't lie. Spikes in disturbance reports, most dismissed, but a pattern clear as ripples on calm water. Each one tied to Claudia's security patrols, each logged like they were law enforcement when they weren't. The misuse jumped off the screen. The real trick wasn't in raw complaints. It was in how they stacked. Elderly residents cited for obstruction when they paused too long on the path. Families threatened with trespass warnings while grilling on the community lawn. One notice even mentioned unauthorized chalk use, directed at a child's sidewalk art. Every line screamed abuse of power. I could already feel how it might play in county hands, private guards acting as cops, weaponizing policy into punishment. I leaned back, staring at the blue glow of the monitor. This was bigger than my mother's pain, bigger than a red violation notice. It was a scheme, deliberate and targeted. Claudia wasn't just misinterpreting bylaws. She was writing her own script and forcing the rest of us to live under it, and that made it dangerous. The complaint logs included video uploads. One caught my eye. Shaky cell phone footage of a guard shoving an old man off the fishing pier. Another showed a security SUV blocking a cul-de-sac driveway while a woman begged to leave for work. Faces blurred, voices cracked, all of it time-stamped. I cued the clips, cross-referenced addresses, same victims, repeat harassment. This wasn't random, it was systematic. A knock on the office door made me glance up. Officer Ramirez leaned in, his expression curious. "Working late, Chief?" he asked, but it wasn't really a question. He saw the files on the screen, the complaint tracker pulled wide open. He knew better than to press. I gave him a nod. "Just reviewing patterns," I said. He left it at that. But even as the door shut, I could feel the eyes of the department around me. They all knew what had happened at the lake today. The gossip wheel never missed something like that. I copied the files to a secure drive, each one tagged by category: assault, unlawful detainment, intimidation. The more I built the record, the more solid the foundation for outside jurisdiction. This wasn't a neighbor spat. It was private enforcement playing cop, and I knew the county would care about that. They had to. Scrolling back, I found Claudia's signature on multiple enforcement notices scanned into the system. She wasn't hiding her hand. She wanted her name on everything, wanted it stamped like authority. That arrogance was going to be her undoing. HOA presidents loved to believe they sat on thrones. They never realized how thin the paper crown really was. When the clock hit midnight, I shut the terminal down, the glow fading into shadow. My mother was safe for now, but safety was temporary unless I pushed this higher. Claudia wanted everyone tired, afraid, too weary to fight. She hadn't calculated for me. For someone who lived inside jurisdictional lines every day, someone who could thread evidence into chains that actually held. As I walked out of the station, the night air hit cold against my skin, carrying the smell of damp asphalt. Streetlights hummed overhead, a reminder of who really owned the dark and who just played pretend. Claudia could tape her notices, could send her guards to swing tasers and bark orders, but she'd crossed a line she didn't even know existed. And once the county saw what I had tonight, she wouldn't be writing policy anymore. I slid into my car, thumbed the ignition, and let the engine growl awake. Headlights swept across the empty lot, catching the badge number painted on the station door. That number wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who'd called. In Afraid, everyone forced quiet under HOA threats. Tomorrow, they'd see movement. Tomorrow, the board would feel what real consequences looked like. The next morning, the sun broke over Lake Haven shores with a glare that turned the clubhouse's glass doors into mirrors. I parked just outside the HOA office, every step across the gravel lot measured, deliberate. Today wasn't about charges or courtrooms. It was about seeing cracks in the board, the kind that only show when pressure rises. Inside, the air was cool, smelling faintly of polish and chlorine drifting in from the pool beyond the windows. Residents shuffled papers in the waiting area, whispering complaints they were too afraid to voice out loud. Claudia's presence filled the space even before she appeared. Her rules were painted on posters, her notices plastered on bulletin boards. Every corner bore her stamp. But it wasn't Claudia I was here to see. It was Jordan Miller, the board member who never seemed comfortable in his own chair. He spotted me almost immediately, his hand hesitating on a stack of meeting minutes he'd been sorting. The pages slipped slightly, uneven in his grip, before he caught them with a nervous flick. That stumble said more than words. "Chief," he said, forcing his mouth into a polite curve that never reached his eyes. His shoulders pulled tight, posture caught halfway between defense and apology. He looked like a man carrying something heavy he couldn't set down. "Morning, Jordan," I answered, my tone steady. I wasn't here as an officer, not officially, but he knew what I carried, and the weight of it unsettled him. He gestured toward the meeting table, but his hand hovered in the air, then dropped back to his side. "You're checking on your mother?" The words were cautious, as if even acknowledging what happened yesterday might cost him something. His gaze darted to the closed office door behind him, where Claudia was surely waiting, already plotting her next decree. "I am," I said, letting the silence after hang long enough for his nerves to show. He swallowed, eyes falling to the floor tiles, tapping his pen against his leg like a tick he couldn't stop. Every movement screamed conflict, wanting to speak, terrified to be overheard. Claudia's voice bled through the door, muffled but sharp. She was dictating letters, issuing new fines. Jordan's jaw tightened. He shuffled the papers again, too forcefully this time, sending one sliding onto the floor. When he bent to pick it up, his fingers lingered there a second too long, knuckles white against the polished tile. He didn't want to stand back up, didn't want to look me in the eye. I bent down and handed the page back to him. "Careful," I said quietly. His nod was jerky, his throat working like he'd swallowed gravel. In that flicker, I saw it. The guilt, the fear, the urge to do the right thing smothered under Claudia's shadow. He was in too deep, and he knew it. Jordan finally forced himself upright, stacking the minutes with unnecessary precision, as though neat lines might hide the chaos in his chest. His voice, when it came, was low, almost conspiratorial. "You know this place isn't how it looks," he muttered, then flinched as though the words had betrayed him. He glanced back at the closed door, shoulders tightening, waiting for it to burst open. "I know," I replied. That was all. No push, no demand, just acknowledgement. His eyes flicked up at me, surprised by the lack of pressure. His lips parted, then closed again. Whatever confession lingered, there wasn't ready to surface. Not yet. But the fracture was showing. Residents began trickling in for a scheduled hearing, murmurs filling the foyer. Claudia emerged, heels snapping like gunshots on the floor, her smile a mask of satisfaction. Jordan straightened instantly, papers clutched like a shield, face returning to practice neutrality. But his foot tapped against the base of the table, restless, unable to hide the storm brewing underneath. I watched the scene unfold, calm on the outside, cataloging every detail. Claudia would see me as another problem to crush. But Jordan? He was the lever, the hinge on which her empire could turn. His body already spoke the truth, his mouth was too afraid to say. And when the time came, that truth would matter more than any violation notice ever could. For now, I left him there, spine stiff but hands trembling, a man caught between complicity and conscience. And I knew the choice he made soon would decide how far Claudia's power could stretch, or snap. I stepped out of the clubhouse foyer, leaving Jordan behind with his trembling hands and tight shoulders. The air outside was heavy with the scent of cut grass, sharp under the heat of late morning. Across the street, the lake shimmered bright, a calm mask for what Claudia was about to unleash. I didn't need to guess. When control starts to slip, people like her only know one move: clamp down harder. By the time evening came, the community boathouse deck was already occupied. Claudia stood there with her clipboard, flanked by two of her private guards, both dressed in uniforms designed to look official, but not quite crossing the line. She thrived on that illusion, on the idea that fear of the badge was as good as the law itself. Residents clustered nearby, muttering, some clutching letters, others whispering about new notices delivered that morning. I stopped at the edge of the dock, the wood warm beneath my boots, smelling of lake water and sun-baked pine. One of the guards placed a roll of laminated signs onto the table. Claudia announced them with theatrical satisfaction. Effective immediately, All non-members attempting to use the path or lake access will be cited. Repeat trespassers will be fined and banned. Security has authority to enforce removal. She tapped the page with her nail like it was gospel. Gasps spread through the gathered residents. A woman near the back raised her hand timidly, voice thin. "But my husband walks that path every morning. Doctor's orders." Her sentence trailed off under Claudia's glare. "This is about liability and fairness," Claudia snapped, her words polished to sound official but hollow under the weight of truth. "Anyone who refuses membership risks losing their property privileges." She waved her clipboard like a sword, cutting through any thought of resistance. I folded my arms, saying nothing yet, just observing. The guards shifted restlessly, their eyes on the crowd rather than me. The laminated signs gleamed in the sun, ready to be hammered along the shoreline like warning markers. Each one a symbol of ownership, each one a theft in plain sight. My jaw tightened, but my expression stayed still. Neighbors shuffled closer, unsure whether to leave or argue. Claudia used that hesitation like fuel, feeding off their silence. "The path is no longer open for freeloaders," she declared. "If you're not paying, you're trespassing." The word hit like a slap. I caught Jordan's face in the crowd. He'd followed after all, though he lingered behind the others. His arms were crossed tight, his lips pressed thin, but his foot tapped the deck boards, restless, conflicted. He knew what those signs meant. His body betrayed him again, a storm brewing behind a mask of compliance. I let the silence stretch, long enough for the words to sink into the residents, long enough for them to feel the wrongness of it settle in their bones. Then I spoke. "You don't have authority to redefine access rights." My tone was quiet, but every head turned. Security doesn't deputize itself into law enforcement, and this lake path isn't yours to close. Claudia's eyes narrowed, her smile brittle. "Chief Rourke," she said, savoring the title like a weapon. "This isn't police business. This is private property management. You, of all people, should respect boundaries." I stepped forward until my boots creaked on the edge of the dock. "I do respect boundaries. That's why I know when you've crossed one." My gaze flicked deliberately to the guards, their tasers hanging heavy at their sides. "And yesterday wasn't policy. It was assault." A ripple went through the crowd, murmurs rising. Claudia stiffened, her smirk faltering. She wasn't used to losing control in public. Her guards shifted again, uneasy, their weight suddenly visible to everyone. Jordan's eyes darted between us, his pen tapping against the edge of his notebook. He wanted to speak, but fear locked his throat. I caught his glance and held it for a second, just enough to remind him the truth would matter soon. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretching long across the deck. Claudia tried to rally, flipping her clipboard with a dramatic flourish. "These rules are in effect immediately," she barked. But the conviction had thinned, and the crowd knew it. I didn't need to shout. I only needed to stand there, calm, certain, a weight she couldn't bend. The guards wouldn't swing their tasers today, not with so many eyes on them, not with cameras already raised in the crowd. Claudia had escalated, but she'd miscalculated too. Every sign she hammered, every threat she issued was one more piece of evidence waiting to burn her in county hands. And I would make sure it did. The crowd broke slowly after Claudia's declaration, residents peeling away in uneasy silence. Some clutched the laminated signs she'd tried to distribute. Others just shook their heads, muttering as they drifted back toward their porches. I stood until the last of them was gone, then turned away from the boathouse. Claudia thought she'd scored another victory, but she hadn't noticed the way cameras had stayed raised or how Jordan had lingered behind, notebook pressed tight to his chest. Those cracks mattered, and now it was time to dig deeper. The next morning, I drove downtown to the county recorder's office. The building was old stone, its facade weathered by decades of wind off the lake. Inside, the scent of paper and polish wrapped around me, heavy and familiar. Rows of terminals glowed in the dim light, screens waiting for anyone who needed to trace back deeds, maps, or contracts. This was where truth lived, carved in ink and scanned into permanence. I signed in, slid into a chair, and began searching. My fingers moved fast, years of police work teaching me how to thread terms through databases, how to narrow searches until only the marrow remained. Lake Haven Shores, easement, shoreline rights. The records began to populate, dull black text on pale backgrounds, but each line pulsed with potential. At first, it looked clean. HOA, incorporation papers, property plats, bylaw filings. Nothing surprising. But then, buried in the index, a deed dated 20 years before the association even existed. My father's name sat bold in the grantor line, the ink faint but legible. He'd deeded the shoreline access as an easement, to remain in perpetuity for resident passage. The phrase jumped out, undeniable, carrying more force than any laminated sign Claudia could dream of. I leaned back, letting the weight of it sink in. This wasn't nostalgia or vague memory. It was written, recorded, sealed. My father had locked the path into the community long before Claudia's empire rose, and she'd been tearing notices from thin air, pretending her clipboard carried more weight than a county record. The clerk behind the desk glanced at me, curious. "Need a certified copy?" she asked. I nodded once, steady. She printed the pages, stamped them, slid them into a manila envelope. The sound of that stamp echoed through the quiet room, final and irreversible. As I walked out, the late morning sun cut sharp across the courthouse steps. The easement burned against my side, heavier than paper had a right to be. I thought of my mother's thumb groove on the rail, my father's voice as he promised the path would always be hers. That promise wasn't just sentimental, it was law. The drive back wound through quiet streets, every house with its trimmed hedges and polished mailboxes, every porch light a reminder of the people Claudia kept under her thumb. They didn't know what lay buried in county files. They didn't know how much ground they still owned, how much freedom she had stolen from them with a smile and a clipboard, but they would. At home, I set the envelope on the table. My mother watched from her chair, eyes still sharp despite the bruising fading along her wrist. I didn't open it for her yet. I only said, "Dad kept his word." She understood without needing to see the pages. Her hand brushed the envelope like it was sacred, like it contained not just paper, but breath returned to her lungs. The easement alone was powerful, but it wasn't enough by itself. I knew how people like Claudia worked. They twisted, stalled, invented. She'd claimed the easement was outdated, invalid, misapplied. But combined with the complaints I'd already gathered, with the video evidence and the assault still fresh in everyone's memory, it became something more, the anchor for outside intervention. I looked out the window toward the lake, where the path glimmered like a scar across the waterline. Claudia thought she'd drawn her boundaries in ink thick enough to erase history, but history was heavier than her threats. And now I had it in my hands, stamped and sealed. The first breach in her fortress had opened. The next move would make sure it never closed again. The easement papers stayed on the table like a stone in the room, solid and immovable. But the bruising on my mother's wrist reminded me that paper alone wasn't enough. Law didn't move unless someone pushed it, and I knew the next step meant crossing into territory where my badge couldn't shield me. If I wanted this fight to hold, it couldn't be mine to prosecute. It had to belong to someone who couldn't be accused of bias. That afternoon, I drove her to urgent care. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, sterile and steady, while the waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. She gripped her cane tightly, her thumb still fitting into the worn groove my father carved years ago. The nurse winced when she saw the marks along her wrist, faint but undeniable. "Conducted energy device exposure," the doctor confirmed quietly, noting it in the chart with a pen that scratched too loudly against the paper. Words clinical, but weight heavy. Assault on a senior. As my mother rested under observation, I stepped into the hallway. The air was cooler here, humming with machines, the beeping of monitors distant but insistent. I dialed the county prosecutor's office, leaving a message with the intake clerk. Then I called the sheriff's department, detailing the assault, the impersonation of authority, and the easement violation. Every syllable measured, stripped of personal color. I recused myself from the matter, making it clear I wasn't investigating my own street. My voice stayed even, but my pulse hammered as the words left my mouth. Handing it off wasn't weakness. It was the only way to make sure Claudia couldn't spin this as personal vendetta. When I hung up, I leaned against the wall, eyes closed for a moment. I could still hear Claudia's voice on the dock, spitting the word trespass like it was scripture. I could see the way Jordan's hands trembled, how he couldn't quite meet my eyes. They thought this battle would stay contained within HOA lines. They didn't realize the county had already stepped in. Back in the exam room, my mother's voice was soft, but steady. "You're not handling it yourself, are you?" Her eyes searched mine, sharp despite the fatigue. I shook my head. "Not this time. It's out of my hands now." She nodded once, the tension in her shoulders easing. For her, it wasn't just about justice. It was about knowing I wouldn't destroy myself carrying all of it alone. On the drive home, the sky had turned a deep orange, clouds burning against the horizon. My hands tightened on the wheel. Each mile brought me closer to the place where this all began. The path carved into the lake's edge, the rail my father marked with care. I pulled over near the shoreline, watching the water ripple in the fading light. The air smelled of algae and wet stone, grounding me, reminding me why this mattered. I opened the envelope one more time, the seal already broken. The stamped easement stared back, the words steady, untouchable, in perpetuity. I whispered it aloud, the syllables cutting through the wind like iron. It meant forever. It meant Claudia couldn't erase what was written before she ever sat in her chair of power. But law without evidence of harm was just ink. That's why my mother's medical chart mattered. That's why the body cam footage mattered. The taser discharge, the bruises, the complaints, all of it stacked together, each piece adding weight until the balance tipped. And once the county weighed in, Claudia's threats wouldn't hold. She'd crossed the line from policy into criminal conduct, and there was no path back. The lake lapped against the rocks below, steady, indifferent. It didn't care who claimed ownership, who taped signs to doors, who sent guards to posture in uniforms. The water only remembered the hands that carved it out, the lives tied to it. And tonight, with the easement secure and the county alerted, I knew those hands hadn't worked in vain. Claudia thought she had time, thought fear would keep the community still. But the clock had already started, and it wasn't set by her. It was set by stamped paper, bruised skin, and a county line she couldn't redraw. And soon, she'd learn just how little power her clipboard really held. The next day brought a restless quiet to Lake Haven shores. Claudia's guards were still stationed at the dock, but their presence had taken on a strained edge. They shifted too often, glanced at passing cars with unease, and avoided the cell phones that residents now openly held in their hands. The tide was changing, even if Claudia couldn't see it. I knew where it was heading, and I knew who would tip the balance. Late afternoon found me at Avery's dock, a weathered stretch of planks jutting into the water where neighbors sometimes gathered to fish. The air smelled of cedar and gasoline from the old outboard tied nearby. I wasn't surprised to see Jordan there, standing alone, his notebook clutched against his chest as though it might shield him. His posture gave him away before his words ever could. Shoulders hunched, foot tapping a restless beat against the boards. He looked like a man rehearsing a confession. He turned when he heard my steps, his face tight with conflict. "I didn't ask you here," he said quickly, though his voice betrayed more hope than defiance. "You didn't have to," I replied. "You've been carrying something too heavy." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You don't know the half of it." His fingers worried the edge of the notebook until the paper inside crumpled. He kept glancing at the lake, as if its surface might swallow his words if he finally let them free. "Claudia's losing ground," I said, keeping my tone even. "But intent matters. People will ask if she knew the path wasn't hers to close." Jordan's jaw tightened. His shoulders rose and fell with a long breath. And then the dam cracked. "She knew," he whispered. His eyes darted to mine, searching for judgment. We all did. There were meetings, minutes. The easement came up more than once. She ordered us not to circulate the notes, said it would cause confusion. I signed them. Every time. His hand trembled as he held the notebook out, then pulled it back, caught between release and fear. The weight of his admission hung heavy over the dock. A gull cried overhead, sharp and distant. He rubbed at his temple, shaking his head. I told myself it wasn't my fight, that keeping quiet wasn't the same as agreeing. But after yesterday, after what she did to your mother, his voice broke, low and hoarse. I can't pretend anymore. I watched him wrestle, his body betraying the struggle even as his mouth tried to stay controlled. His knee bounced, his grip tightened, his throat worked against words that threatened to spill faster than he wanted. The conflict wasn't abstract. It lived in every twitch of his frame. "What's in the notebook, Jordan?" I asked. He stared at it, as if unsure whether it was evidence or a curse. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he opened it. Inside were copied notes, careful handwriting, recording what Claudia had forced. Underground. Dates, discussions, references to the easement. Proof that the board had acknowledged it, and proof that they had deliberately chosen to ignore it. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the pages. "I kept these for myself," he admitted, voice cracking. "I thought maybe one day I'd need them, or someone else would. I never imagined it would go this far." He shoved the notebook toward me suddenly, as though the weight of it had finally become unbearable. "Take it. I don't want it anymore." I slid it into my bag, the leather creaking as it swallowed his burden. "This helps," I said simply. His eyes widened slightly, relief mingling with dread. He wasn't absolved, not yet, but confession had cracked the hold Claudia had over him. The water lapped quietly against the dock, steady and timeless. Jordan stared out at it, his shoulders sagging, the fight inside him finally loosening its grip. "She's going to destroy me for this," he muttered. "No," I told him. "She already destroyed herself. You're just letting the truth breathe." His head dropped, but his body eased for the first time since I'd seen him. He had crossed the line from silence into action, and with that step, Claudia's empire lost its shield. The choice was his, but the consequences were hers. The sun dipped lower, staining the lake orange. For the first time, I felt the tide turning not just in evidence, but in will. The cracks in Claudia's rule weren't just showing. They were breaking open, and Jordan had just handed me the hammer to finish the job. The last streaks of orange had barely faded from the lake by the time I drove across town to the city attorney's office. Jordan's notebook sat on the passenger seat, its weight impossible to ignore. Every bump in the road reminded me what it contained. Deliberate concealment, minutes that proved Claudia's abuse wasn't ignorance, but intent. That difference mattered, and tonight it was time to align the next phase of the plan. The municipal building was quiet, most offices dark, but the conference room light glowed steady. I'd called ahead, and Assistant City Attorney Linda Carver was waiting, stacks of case files pushed aside to make space. She wasn't smiling when I walked in. Her expression was sharp, already measuring the situation. "You said this wasn't official police business," she began, voice even but skeptical. "It's not," I replied, setting the envelope and Jordan's notebook on the table. "That's why I'm here. HOA misconduct, impersonation of authority, assault on a senior, and concealment of evidence by the board." Linda slid the easement copy out first, running her finger along the phrase, "in perpetuity." Her brows lifted slightly, then she opened the notebook, scanning the handwritten lines. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she read the entries. "They knew," she murmured. "This wasn't just sloppy governance. It was suppression." I nodded. "Which means this isn't a civil spat anymore. It's a pattern. It qualifies for county jurisdiction, maybe even state regulators if the security firm acted outside licensing authority." The room was silent for a moment, except for the rustle of pages. The air smelled faintly of toner and old carpet, the hum of the overhead light constant. Linda finally set the notebook down and leaned back. "If you were investigating this as chief, Claudia would scream conflict of interest. Handing it over here protects the process." "That's the point," I said. "I'm not here as chief. I'm here as a son whose mother was assaulted, and as a resident with recorded rights being trampled. The evidence stands on its own." Linda tapped her pen against the easement copy, steady and thoughtful. "The county prosecutor will need a referral packet, and the state will want to know about the guards. Send me everything you've logged, complaints, videos, body cam records. I'll draft the framework." I slid a thumb drive across the table. Already prepared. The leather of my bag creaked as I leaned back, the tension in my shoulders finally loosening just slightly. This was the pivot point. With the city attorney in play, the fight left Claudia's world of laminated signs and entered a system she couldn't bend. Linda gave a short nod. This isn't going away quietly. Be ready for backlash. I've been ready since the moment she put a taser to my mother's skin, I said. Her gaze softened just briefly, then she gathered the files into neat stacks. We'll loop in the county by morning. Claudia's board won't see it coming. When I left the building, the night air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain off the lake. Streetlights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. For the first time since this started, I felt the weight shift from my shoulders to the system built to carry it. Claudia wanted a battlefield of notices and intimidation. I'd pulled her into a courtroom she couldn't control. Driving back, I passed through the quiet streets of Lake Haven shores. Porch lights glowed, curtains twitched, neighbors whispering behind closed doors. They didn't know yet, but momentum was already turning. Soon the threats taped to their doors would mean nothing compared to the charges waiting to land on Claudia's desk. At home, my mother was asleep in her chair, the cane resting beside her. I covered her with a blanket and set Jordan's notebook back on the table, beside the stamped easement. 2 anchors, one written by law, the other by conscience. Together, they were more than evidence. They were leverage. The path forward was clear now. The county would move, the state would follow, and Claudia's paper crown would finally catch fire. She'd chosen the wrong battleground and the wrong family to test, and soon she'd learn the cost of pretending her rules could outrun the law. By the next evening, word had already spread. I could feel it in the way neighbors lingered outside their homes. Conversations cut short when headlights passed, whispers swelling and fading like wind through the trees. Something was shifting. Claudia's threats no longer carried the same weight, and the signs she'd posted on fences and trailheads looked brittle under porch lights. Tonight, the community was gathering, not in fear, but with purpose. The town library's small auditorium became our refuge. Rows of folding chairs lined the polished wood floor. The smell of dust and old paper thickened the air. A faint hum from the overhead projectors echoed like a pulse. Residents filled every seat, others standing along the walls, clutching copies of violation letters or printouts of complaint emails. The energy in the room wasn't just anger. It was relief that, finally, someone had stepped forward. I stood near the front, not at a podium, not in uniform. This wasn't about authority by badge. It was about authority by truth. My mother sat in the first row, her cane resting across her lap, her bruises fading but still visible. Her presence reminded everyone why we were here, because intimidation had gone too far, and silence had already cost too much. Avery, whose doc had hosted Jordan's confession, opened the meeting. His voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as he spoke of years of threats, fines, and fear. Each word landed heavier than the last, carried by nods and murmurs of agreement. Then he gestured for me to take the floor. I laid the certified easement copy on the table, its county seal glinting under the lights. "This isn't a memory," I said, my voice steady. "It's a recorded right. The path was deeded for residents before the HOA even existed. No board vote can erase that." I let the words hang, watching his shoulders straightened across the room. Then I held up Jordan's notebook. He wasn't here, too afraid still, but his words were. I read the passages aloud. Board discussions acknowledging the easement, decisions to suppress the minutes, Claudia's directives to keep the truth hidden. Each sentence turned the air heavier, until the only sound was the soft scrape of pens as neighbors scribbled notes. Hands shot up. A woman near the back stood, voice shaking with rage. "They threatened to lean my house over a basketball hoop. I thought I was alone." Another added, "My kids were told they'd be fined for chalk drawings on the sidewalk." Stories spilled out, overlapping, building a pattern no one could deny. The notebook and easement weren't isolated. They were the spine of something everyone had felt but couldn't name. We passed around forms I'd prepared, simple affidavits for sworn statements. Residents lined up, eager to sign, each signature another stone in the foundation of a case that would no longer live in whispers. The sound of pens scratching filled the room, steady, relentless. Some included photos, others attached videos, each one logged and dated. In the back row, I saw neighbors who had once been silent, now raising their phones, recording everything. This wasn't fear anymore. It was evidence, preserved and shared. Claudia's threats were dissolving in real time, replaced by solidarity. I gathered the stack of signed statements, tucking them carefully into a binder. Each page represented a voice that could no longer be ignored. Together with the easement and Jordan's notes, they formed a wall she couldn't climb. Before we adjourned, I spoke once more. This isn't just about my family or any one violation. It's about a system that was twisted into intimidation. Tonight you chose to step out of silence. That choice matters. The room erupted in quiet applause, not loud or theatrical, but steady, deliberate. It wasn't celebration. It was resolve. As the meeting closed, neighbors stayed behind, talking, sharing numbers, making plans to attend the next county hearing together. For the first time, Lake Haven Shores felt less like a collection of houses and more like a community ready to fight back. I walked my mother to the car, the binder under my arm heavy but secure. The night air smelled of rain and fresh-cut grass, grounding me in the moment. Claudia still sat in her clubhouse throne, clipboard in hand, believing she controlled the game. But tonight, the residents of Lake Haven Shores had built something she couldn't touch. Unity, sworn, and signed. The strategy was no longer theory, it was in motion. And when the county saw what we carried, the balance would tilt for good. The binder of sworn statements never left my side that night. By morning, it sat in the passenger seat as I drove through county lines, the weight of it pressing against me like a reminder of every voice that had signed their name. The air was sharp with the bite of early rain, droplets streaking across the windshield as the courthouse loomed ahead. Today wasn't about promises. Today was about putting Claudia's empire under a light she couldn't control. The county sheriff's press room smelled faintly of coffee and old varnish. Flags lined the wall, and microphones stood in neat rows on the podium. Deputies moved with quiet purpose, carrying files, checking equipment, nodding greetings as they passed. This was their rhythm, a language of order and authority that no laminated sign could mimic. I signed in at the desk, handing over the binder and the certified easement. The clerk's eyes widened at the sheer volume, but she didn't ask questions. She knew it wasn't just paperwork. It was fuel. Sheriff Daniels met me at the doorway, his frame broad, his handshake firm. "Rourke," he said, voice low but steady. "You kept your distance like you said you would?" "Every step," I answered. "I'm here as a resident, not a chief. This belongs to you now." He studied me for a moment, then tapped the "A binder? This is enough to justify a cease and desist on enforcement. If the board's been impersonating authority, the state licensing board will want in on this too. And if a senior was assaulted..." His words trailed, but the weight of them hung between us. Cameras flashed as we entered the room. Residents had gathered in the back, some from Lake Haven Shores, their faces pale but determined. The sheriff adjusted the microphone, his tone measured but clear as he laid out the announcement. A formal cease and desist order served to Lake Haven Shores HOA, suspension of private security authority pending state review, and a criminal investigation into the use of conducted energy devices on a protected person. The words echoed against the paneled walls, each syllable striking like a hammer. I stood off to the side, watching as the news spread through the room. Phones came up, messages pinged, neighbors whispered. Claudia's kingdom wasn't being chipped away anymore. It was being dismantled in public. After the press cleared, Daniels turned to me. "You did the right thing stepping back. Keeps it clean. We'll serve the order by evening." The phrase struck me with a quiet finality. By evening. The thought of Claudia receiving that notice, not from me but from the county deputies, carried a satisfaction sharper than anger. She wouldn't be able to shout it down, wouldn't be able to tape over it with another violation notice. It would be the first piece of paper she couldn't bend. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air heavy with the smell of wet asphalt. Residents from the back of the room approached hesitantly, one woman clutching her husband's arm as she whispered thanks. Another man pressed a photo into my hand, his driveway blocked by Claudia's guards. "They can't do this anymore, right?" he asked, his voice trembling between hope and disbelief. "No," I said firmly. "Not anymore." I slid the photo into my jacket pocket. Every scrap of evidence mattered, not for me now, but for the investigators who would build the case stronger than I ever could. My role was shifting, from collector to witness, from fighter to anchor, Driving back toward Lake Haven shores, I passed the faded wooden sign that marked the community entrance. For the first time, it looked smaller, less like a fortress wall, and more like a gate ready to fall. Inside, porch lights flickered on as dust settled. Families gathered on driveways, whispering the news already spreading from phone to phone. The dock was quiet when I reached it. The laminated signs Claudia had posted still flapped against the railing, edges curling from rain. Soon they'd be stripped away by deputies in uniform, replaced by a county seal she couldn't peel off. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the water slap against the pilings, the sound steady and indifferent. By evening, the order would be in her hands, and with it, the walls she built around. Lake Haven shores would start to collapse, one board, one rule, one lie at a time. The following night, the HOA clubhouse ballroom filled like it never had before. Folding chairs scraped across the polished floor, residents crowding shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in anxious murmurs. The air smelled faintly of dust and coffee, but underneath it was the crackle of tension, sharp and electric. Tonight wasn't another staged HOA meeting. Tonight was confrontation. Claudia sat at the head table, clipboard front and center like a scepter. Her eyes scanned the room with the same brittle confidence I'd seen 100 times, though the corners of her smirk twitched. The laminated signs she'd ordered lined the back wall, props for her performance. But the crowd wasn't playing along anymore. Too many of them had seen the sheriff's announcement. Too many had signed affidavits now locked into the county system. Her control was already bleeding out, though she didn't realize how quickly. I stood off to the side, not at the center, not leading. This wasn't my fight alone anymore. Tonight was the community's. The meeting opened with Claudia's voice, sharp and commanding. The board has voted unanimously to reaffirm membership requirements. Any non-member attempting to use the lake path will be fined, and repeat violations may result in property liens. She tapped her clipboard, trying to project authority, but the words fell flatter than usual. Murmurs rose, louder than before, laced with open defiance. Then the doors opened, and deputies in uniform entered. Their presence froze the room. The county seal on the paperwork they carried spoke louder than anything I could have said. Claudia stiffened, her knuckles whitening around her pen. Lake Haven Shores HOA, one deputy read clearly, is hereby ordered to cease and desist enforcement of shoreline and path access restrictions, pending full investigation. He set the notice on the table in front of Claudia. Another deputy posted a copy on the back wall, covering one of her laminated signs. The contrast was stark. Official seal over plastic. Authority over pretense. The room erupted. Some gasped, some clapped, others simply exhaled relief like they had been holding their breath for years. Claudia's voice cut through, shrill and desperate. This is intimidation. This is an overreach. The HOA maintains... But before she could finish, a voice rose from the crowd. Jordan, he'd chosen his moment. He stood, notebook in hand, his face pale but his jaw set. The board knew about the easement, he said, his words trembling but clear. We discussed it. We recorded it. Claudia ordered us not to release the minutes. The room went silent. His confession echoed like a crack across the ballroom. Every eye turned to him, then to Claudia. She flushed red, sputtering, "That's a lie!" Jordan shook his head, flipping open the notebook. His handwriting stared back, neat and undeniable. "It's not a lie. It's here, and I won't hide it anymore." His hand trembled, but he didn't falter. He walked to the deputies and handed them the notebook. His shoulders sagged as though a weight had lifted, but his eyes were steady for the first time. The murmurs swelled into open outrage. Neighbors shouted, holding up their violation notices, demanding answers. Claudia tried to regain control, banging her clipboard against the table, but the sound was swallowed by the voices rising against her. The walls of silence she'd built around this community crumbled in real time. One deputy addressed the crowd firmly. "If you believe you've been subjected to unlawful enforcement, please come forward. Sworn statements will be accepted tonight." The line formed instantly, residents pressing forward, clutching papers, phones, photographs. Years of fear poured out in a flood that no clipboard could dam. Claudia sat frozen, her smirk gone, her voice drowned beneath the tide. For the first time, she looked small, her authority stripped bare. I stayed back, arms crossed, watching as the community found its voice. This wasn't about me standing at the front anymore. It was about them realizing the rules that had shackled them were nothing more than illusions once exposed to real law. By the time the deputies left with the evidence in hand, the residents hadn't just broken silence. They'd reclaimed their ground. Claudia remained at the head table, surrounded by papers that no longer meant anything. And I knew. The final blow was already in motion. The board's power had collapsed under its own weight, and nothing Claudia said now could stitch it back together. By dawn, the echoes of the confrontation in the clubhouse still lingered across Lake Haven shores. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke openly on porches, their voices stronger, carrying in the morning air. Claudia hadn't stepped outside since the deputies served the order, and the silence around her home was louder than all her past threats combined. That afternoon, I returned to the lakeside memorial bench, the one carved in my father's name years ago. The old canoe hung back in our garage, still waiting, but this bench was where his voice always felt clearest. The lake shimmered as if it too knew something had shifted. For the first time in years, residents walked the paths without looking over their shoulders. Children ran ahead, laughter echoing against the waterline that had once felt like a prison wall. My mother sat beside me, her cane resting in the thumb groove he'd carved decades ago. Her bruises had faded, but her eyes were sharp, steady, and full of something I hadn't seen since before this war began. Peace. "He would have been proud," she whispered, nodding toward the families moving freely along the shoreline. "He built this for them, not for someone with a clipboard to sell piece by piece." I nodded, my throat tight. And now, it's theirs again. The county prosecutor had already filed charges: misrepresentation, assault, concealment of official records. Claudia's name was stamped across every page, her power crumbling into evidence. Jordan's notebook had become the keystone, his confession tipping the scales. He wasn't in hiding anymore. Word was he'd resigned from the board, but he walked the path with his neighbors now, shoulders lighter without secrets pressing them down. At the library auditorium, new meetings formed, not ruled by fines or threats, but by planning. Community barbecues, shared gardens, discussions about transparency and shared governance. For the first time in decades, Lake Haven Shores felt like what it was meant to be: a neighborhood, not a fiefdom. I looked across the water, where the boathouse stood empty. The laminated signs Claudia had plastered along the docks were gone, stripped away by deputies and discarded. In their place, the county seal still hung, a reminder that authority doesn't come from fear, but from law. "Do you think she'll ever come back from it?" my mother asked quietly. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not here." She built her power on silence. Once people find their voices, they don't give them back. She smiled faintly, leaning her hand against mine. Then it was worth it. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the water orange and gold. Around us, the community moved freely, every step proof that this fight hadn't been about winning against Claudia. It had been about winning something back. As I stood, the breeze caught the easement copy still folded in my jacket pocket. I hadn't needed to carry it anymore. County records held the truth now, but I kept it close anyway. It was more than evidence. It was a promise fulfilled, one my father had carved into wood, one I had carried through every confrontation. I turned toward the camera I'd set on the bench, red light blinking. Not for evidence this time, but for every person who'd ever felt trapped under the weight of an HOA that forgot what it meant to serve. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. The wind shifted, carrying the laughter of children down the path, and I knew the story of Lake Haven Shores was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the community that had finally claimed its ground, to a legacy restored, and to the truth that no clipboard, no sign, and no threat could ever erase.